I was told time and again to be cautious around you, but I chose to ignore the warnings. Now, the aftermath is unfolding, and I'm left grappling with the consequences of my choices. Despite the countless voices cautioning me, I walked this path with you. Now, in the quiet aftermath, I am left to face the reality of their warnings coming true. Everyone said you would bring trouble, yet I didn't heed their advice. Now, as I confront the fallout, I realize the weight of their warnings was heavier than I understood. I ignored the red flags and trusted you, despite the warnings from those who cared about me. Now, as the dust settles, I'm left to reckon with the impact of my choices. The warnings were loud and clear, but my heart wanted to believe otherwise. Now, as I deal with the aftermath, I am faced with the harsh reality of their truth. I dismissed the concerns of those around me and followed my heart straight to you. Now, the consequences of my decisions are unraveling, and I'm left to confront the truth. Everyone tried to protect me from the fallout of being with you. I didn't listen, and now I'm paying the price, grappling with the reality they foresaw. I should have listened when they warned me about you. Now, as I navigate the consequences, I realize how much wisdom was hidden in their words. Ignoring the warnings seemed like an act of bravery at the time. Now, dealing with the aftermath, I see it was a misstep that led me to a place of regret. I heard the warnings, but chose to follow my own path. Now, as I face the consequences, I am learning the hard way that sometimes those warnings are meant to be heeded. The voices of caution were persistent, yet I chose to embrace you despite them. Now, as the consequences unfold, I find myself reflecting on the wisdom I ignored. I believed I knew better and dismissed the warnings about you. Now, dealing with the repercussions, I see how their concerns were spot on. Everyone saw the pitfalls ahead and tried to warn me. I chose to ignore their advice, and now, dealing with the consequences, I see the wisdom I overlooked. I chose to follow my heart over the warnings from those around me. Now, facing the reality of the consequences, I wish I had listened more closely. Their warnings seemed like an overreaction at the time. Now, as I face the fallout, I understand the depth of their concern and the weight of their words. I was warned about the dangers of being with you, but my own desires clouded my judgment. Now, as the consequences become apparent, I am left with a heavy heart. I dismissed the advice given to me about you. Now, the consequences are unfolding, and I find myself grappling with the truth I chose to ignore. The warnings were there, but I was too eager to believe in a different outcome. Now, as I deal with the aftermath, I regret not heeding those early cautions. I ignored the signs and the warnings from others. Now, as the impact of my choices becomes clear, I realize how costly my decision to disregard their advice was. Despite numerous warnings, I followed my heart into a situation fraught with risk. Now, I'm dealing with the reality of those risks and the consequences that followed. I should have listened when everyone warned me about you. Now, as I face the results of my decisions, I am learning the true value of their advice. The warnings were a chorus of concern, yet I chose to ignore them. Now, as I face the repercussions, I'm left reflecting on the wisdom I failed to recognize. I thought I knew better and dismissed the warnings about you. Now, dealing with the fallout, I see how their predictions were closer to the truth than I realized. Everyone tried to guide me away from the trouble you might bring. I didn't listen, and now, as I deal with the aftermath, I understand the weight of their warnings. I was warned of the consequences of my choices regarding you. Now, in the midst of dealing with the fallout, I'm forced to confront the reality of those warnings. The advice to stay away was clear, but I chose to ignore it. Now, facing the aftermath, I realize the truth behind those warnings and their accuracy. Despite the numerous warnings, I followed my heart straight to you. Now, as I face the consequences, I am left to confront the reality of those predictions. The warnings were there, but my heart wanted what it wanted. Now, as I navigate the consequences, I wish I had heeded the concerns of those who cared. Everyone cautioned me about the potential fallout from being with you. Now, dealing with the reality of their predictions, I see the truth of their warnings. I ignored the warnings and pursued you regardless. Now, the consequences are clear, and I am left dealing with the fallout of my choices. The warnings from others seemed overly dramatic at the time. Now, facing the consequences, I see how accurate those warnings were and the wisdom I missed. The warnings seemed like an overreaction at the time, but now, as I deal with the fallout, I see how accurate and necessary they were. Everyone told me to be cautious, but I chose to follow my own path. Now, facing the consequences, I understand why their warnings were so important. The advice to stay away was there, but I let my feelings cloud my judgment. Now, as the consequences unfold, I realize how wise their warnings truly were. I was warned about the potential for trouble, yet I ignored the advice. Now, dealing with the results, I see how justified their concerns were. The warnings about you were persistent and clear, but I chose to ignore them. Now, as I face the aftermath, I understand the truth behind those warnings. I thought I could manage despite the warnings, but now, dealing with the consequences, I see how right they were about the risks involved. Everyone saw the potential for problems and tried to warn me. I didn't listen, and now, as I deal with the fallout, I realize the depth of their concerns. Ignoring the warnings seemed like a brave choice at the time. Now, facing the consequences, I understand how crucial their advice was. I was given many warnings about you, but I chose to follow my heart. Now, as the consequences become clear, I regret not listening to the advice I received. The warnings were loud and clear, but I was too stubborn to listen. Now, as I navigate the fallout, I see the truth behind their concerns. Everyone tried to steer me away from you, but I ignored their advice. Now, dealing with the consequences, I understand the wisdom I overlooked. I chose to disregard the warnings about you, believing I could handle the outcome. Now, facing the consequences, I see how misguided I was. The advice to stay away seemed unnecessary at the time, but now, dealing with the fallout, I realize how essential it was. Despite the warnings, I followed my instincts. Now, as I deal with the repercussions, I see how accurate those early cautions were. Everyone warned me about you, but I dismissed their concerns. Now, dealing with the aftermath, I am left reflecting on the wisdom I ignored. I ignored the warnings from those who cared about me, thinking I knew better. Now, as I face the consequences, I understand the depth of their advice. The warnings seemed excessive when I first heard them, but now, facing the results of my decisions, I see how justified their concerns were. Everyone tried to protect me from the potential fallout of being with you. I didn't heed their advice, and now, as I confront the consequences, I see the truth. The advice to avoid you was clear and persistent. I chose to ignore it, and now, as I deal with the repercussions, I understand the value of their warnings. I thought I could handle the risks despite the warnings. Now, facing the reality of my choices, I see how accurate their predictions were. Ignoring the warnings about you seemed like a risk worth taking at the time. Now, dealing with the aftermath, I understand how misguided that choice was. Everyone warned me about you, but I followed my own path. Now, as the consequences unfold, I realize how right they were about the risks. The warnings were there, but I chose to believe in a different outcome. Now, dealing with the fallout, I see how those warnings were grounded in truth. I ignored the advice given to me about you, thinking I could manage. Now, as the consequences become clear, I understand the wisdom I overlooked. The warnings about you seemed like overprotectiveness. Now, as I face the results, I see how their concerns were more valid than I realized. Everyone cautioned me against you, but I chose to disregard their advice. Now, dealing with the consequences, I see the truth behind their warnings. The warnings about you seemed extreme, but now, facing the aftermath, I see how accurate and necessary they were. I didn't listen to the warnings, believing in a different outcome. Now, dealing with the fallout, I am confronted with the reality of their advice. The advice to stay away was clear, yet I chose to ignore it. Now, as the consequences unfold, I regret not heeding their warnings. I dismissed the warnings and followed my own desires. Now, facing the results, I understand the gravity of their concerns. The warnings seemed like an overreaction at the time. Now, as I deal with the fallout, I see how justified those warnings were. Everyone warned me about the potential for trouble, but I chose to ignore them. Now, dealing with the aftermath, I see the wisdom in their advice. I followed my heart despite the warnings. Now, as I face the consequences, I wish I had listened more carefully to the concerns of others. The warnings about you were numerous and clear. I chose to overlook them, and now, dealing with the fallout, I see the truth behind those early cautions.